In 3, 2, 1, what's up, and welcome back to the Sports Medicine Broadcast, a podcast to promote and improve your practice as an athletic trainer. I'm Benjamin Stevenson, second-year MAT student at U of H, joined by my mentee, Joey Correa, who's a first-year MAT student at U of H. Say hi.
How's it going?
And then we also have our interviewee, who is Matthew Hutton, Houston Dynamo athletic trainer. He just did his presentation over bridging the rehab gap. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
The first question I want to ask you personally is how you were inspired to become an AT in the Houston Dynamo.
The inspiration to be an AT started when I was in high school. I knew I was pretty good at science and math, but I didn't really know what I wanted to specialize in. And so I shadowed a few medical fields thinking that I wanted to go into medicine. I went and shadowed a dentist, I think, first. And after one day of shadowing a dentist, I was just miserable. I never wanted to see teeth again. So I knew I didn't want to be a dentist anymore. I went and shadowed a physical therapist. And at the time, this was in rural Iowa, and there was like no athletics involved at all. It was all like work comp cases or elderly patients. And after having done really just like table-based exercises for that whole day, I was uninterested in being a physical therapist. And so that was kind of disheartening, but then got injured myself, actually, tore my MCL, and then working with my athletic trainer in my high school was really what inspired me to be an athletic trainer.
Okay. And then how did you find the Houston Dynamo? Did you start in MLS soccer and end up with the Dynamo?
No, actually. So I didn't even know I wanted to work in soccer, and I still don't know what I want to do when I grow up. But I was working with a soccer team in Iowa at a junior college, Indian Hills, and the head coach at the time, Kevin Nuss, he was the former head coach of the goalkeeper coach now with our academy. Soccer is a really small world, and so the soccer coach or the goalkeeper coach reached out to the head coach and asked if he knew any ATs because they were hiring, and so he asked me, or he told me to apply, and I wasn't really sure at the time. I was kind of scared of big cities, didn't know about Houston, and was really hesitant to apply. And he asked me like 2 weeks later if I applied, and I said no. He said, you need to apply. So applied, took the interview, and the rest was history. Worked with the academy for a year and a half, I think, and then been with the second team for the last year and a half.
Yeah. I did a rotation with the academy, so I got to see, you know, what Matthew does above once the kids move on to the second team. So that was really cool. So about your presentation, that was his first presentation, and it was really good. It didn't seem like his first time talking about that subject. But what inspired you about that topic specifically? What made you choose that topic?
I think I've always been a bit geared toward the performance side of things. I've been in and out of gyms. I've been a personal trainer in previous jobs and different gym settings, and working with different sports in the past. I've just always loved working with like competitive athletics, and so that was really kind of what geared me toward like my CSCS, for example. And being in this environment in pro soccer now, it's a collaboration between so many different professionals, and they're all so good at what they do, and just really trying our best to make the best return to play possible. And it's an international collaboration. There's so many people from different countries in soccer that are, like I said, Australia was a big one in hamstring research. The English Premier League is obviously really big, and even South America has contribution to the sports medicine and the return to play side of things. So it's just a really fascinating field, and I love the learning side of it as well. I love to learn from different people in the Houston Dynamo organization as well as internationally.
Yeah. I think whenever I had my rotation at Houston Dynamo, it seemed like the return to play was very structured, very serious. And like you said, you know, it's to maximize performance and, you know, reduce the time loss. And at a place like that, like money is where that matters, you know, that's financial goals, you know, getting the player back and stuff like that. So I think that was really cool coming from that. Could you quickly explain the chronic versus acute load ratios? Because I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. So the research by Gabbett is highlighting essentially you're monitoring their training load over the past somewhere 3 to 5 weeks. There's not quite a gold standard yet, and there's some disagreement whether the ratio is all that relevant to all of the cases. So take it all with a grain of salt, but I think it's helpful to pay attention to avoid spikes in training load. And so, like I said, you monitor the past 3 to 5 weeks, and then you compare the average of those to what this current training week is. So, for example, let's just total distance is probably the easiest to comprehend on a podcast. If they run, let's say, 10 miles, 8 miles, 6 miles, and 12 miles, your average is going to be like 9 miles, right? So if that's your trailing load is running 9 miles per week, and then you go out and you run a marathon, you're at 26 miles for that week. That is a 3x of your acute load in comparison to your chronic. And so if you are getting up into those higher numbers, I think there's some disagreement about what the appropriate ratio is, but it's somewhere in that 1.4 to 1.6 seems to be the happy medium. Anything higher than 2.0 seems to be an injury risk. And so if you're at like that example would be 3.0, then you're definitely flirting with injury. It might not happen again with that exact week, but maybe you're carrying some of that chronic fatigue, and then within your next week or two of training, then you get that injury.
Okay. So the best way to avoid those spikes, if you don't have a catapult, would be kind of tracking your mileage. Because I know y'all use catapult and GPS systems a lot at Dynamo, and I'm going to work at a high school next, so I'm not going to have all those, fancy systems. I'm going to have to calculate their workloads all on myself.
Yeah, without GPS, it's definitely a lot harder. I think mileage is kind of a tricky thing because it's such a big metric as opposed to things like accelerations and decelerations. I would say that the easiest way, it's definitely still complicated, but you could map it out by hand and you could draw out a drill. For example, let's say I'm going to have them do a shuttle run. They're going to run 5 meters that way. They're going to run 10 meters the other direction, and then 5 back to the middle. How many times did they change direction? You've got 1 to start. You've got 2 to stop. You've got 3 to go back the other way. And then you've got 4 to stop and then 5 coming back to the middle. So you've got 5 accelerations and decelerations just in that one rep. So if you're trying to progress things like accelerations and decelerations, then you can still calculate out how many you're going to get. Same thing with high-speed running. You can do the math and say, okay, well, if I have a 100-yard football field and I have them run that in 10 seconds, that's 10 meters per second. That's pretty fast. That's definitely going to be sprint distance. So the thresholds that we use are 5.5 and 7. That would be high speed running and sprint, respectively. And that seems to be pretty universal across different leagues. But if you're using those thresholds, okay, so how long would you have to run to get to 5.5 meters per second across 100 fields? It's going to be roughly, oh gosh, I stitched myself up by making me do my math with no calculator, but roughly it's going to take you, let's say, 16 seconds. So that would be high speed. Whereas a sprint, you're probably going to be maybe 13, 14 seconds, something like that. My math's terrible, so don't quote me on those numbers, but you could do it out and you can calculate the distance that they're running over the time to get their speed.
Okay. So there's a way to do it, guys. Don't worry. I was wondering whether you looked at strength and power whenever you're returning your athletes, and I was wondering what is more important to you specifically with hamstring strains. Is there something you look at more specifically?
The research would go against my hunch. The research definitely backs strength as a protecting variable, and so the two that are talked about the most by I think it was Blanche and Gabbitt's research. The research suggests that the two variables that impact injury the most are going to be strength and fascicle length. And so fascicle length, again, is modifiable by things like stretching, but then you don't get the strength element from stretching. So the eccentric loading of the tissue becomes really important because you're getting both the strength and the fascicle lengthening. But I also think that power gets kind of glanced over. It's an afterthought. And so playing with the variable of speed is really important for me personally. I think that if you just go from really strong Nordic exercise to a sprint, there's too much of a gap in the power output, and I think that's a recipe for disaster.
That's another spike that could, increase the injury risk, like you're saying. I also noticed you were certified in FMS. How did that come about? Because our professor at UH is also certified in that, and she says she doesn't really use it anymore. But you're still in the field, so I'm assuming you use it.
I very rarely will I use it. I think the biggest thing that I got from FMS is actually the framework that they apply and a lot of their progressions. So they talk about in their coursework, you have to crawl before you can walk. You have to walk before you can run. And seeing their kind of ground up approach, they talk about doing things from a kneeling position so that it's a stable base. And then you get to a taller extended position, and then that decreases the stability. So it makes the athlete have to work harder in different exercises. So I think the framework is really good for FMS, but in terms of the actual like testing, it was, for me, I used it a lot when I was at the junior college setting because I was the only clinician who was measuring these things. No, I didn't have a strength and conditioning coach. I didn't have a sports science staff working with me. And so I was using it to test in bulk. I mean, I was taking, I think, 35, maybe 40 guys through a test. It was like a 4-hour testing window, and but it gave us some good insight. And so then from there, what I did is I made a PDF with corrective exercises trying to address some of these limitations that they had. And I think there's better ways to do it, and if you have the time and you have the staff to be able to do it to a higher standard, then that's great. But in a setting where you're at a high school, maybe you're working with a football team and you've got maybe 60 to 100 people, you definitely need something that you can replicate really quickly and just churn through them as fast as you can, but still have some kind of meaningful influence on their corrective exercises.
Do you have any questions, Joey?
Yeah, so my question is more on the mental side of the rehab. In your presentation, you talked about how re-injury can cause a decrease in confidence. So how do you boost the athlete's morale when they have hamstring injuries over and over again?
Yeah, it's definitely tricky. So I don't want to project like I'm the expert in this field. There's definitely like sports psychologists. I did my grad school in sports psychology, so I have a elementary level of education on it, but there are people who are out there who are much better experts than me. But for me, one of the things that I would say is to really understand them as a person and to get to know what they're experiencing. You talk with them, get their symptoms every day, but then just talking through their struggles. Obviously, they're frustrated that they're not out on the field or on the court, and just kind of understanding their struggle, I think, is really helpful to be able to share some empathy with them. So that just the human side, it's not necessarily a calculation or a science, but I think just being a good person helps go a long way with that.
What's been the biggest complication that you've seen in your practice with hamstring strains?
That's another tricky question. I think that there's a host of different complications with hamstrings, and I think I guess the one that jumps out to me first is the fact that we can have somebody who's cranking out 500 newtons on a Nord board, and this is a really strong hamstring score. If you've ever done the Nord board yourself, then you know. I think mine's like 300, just barely crossing into the 300s. And so you've got this guy who's just massively strong. I mean, he could do Nordic probably to the floor and pull himself back up. and yet he's still having hamstring injuries. So I think that we don't really understand the risk variables very well yet. I think according to the research, like we're getting to the fact that it's like what Brian was saying yesterday, is there's no silver bullet. There's so many variables at play. And for me, I think the nervous system plays a big role in that. And I think that a lot of it is fatigue based, where your nervous system is trying to calculate risk, where if I get into this really extended position in the late swing phase, maybe like the muscle spindle is supposed to be contracting to prevent that stretch. Or maybe if it's a tension issue, if there's too much force, the Golgi tendon organ is supposed to kick off the muscle. But the timing of that is so fast, especially in a sprint, that the nervous system has one little, as you fatigue, you have a decreased accuracy of calculation. And I think that timing plays a big role in the injury risk for hamstrings. So I think that, to answer the question shortly, I think that the lack of evidence in terms of risk factors is probably the biggest complication. And I think that the nervous system is just such a tricky thing to study that I think that it makes it hard to know what the injury risk is for things like central nervous system fatigue.
That goes into my next question, and one of my final questions. What is your biggest tip to avoid re-injury?
Yeah, I think it's the smooth approach. I think if you can gradate everything that you're doing I have a background in art, so one of the first exercises that we do is you take 10 boxes and you shade them from 0, it's completely blank piece of paper, and then to as dark as you possibly can, just like mashing your pencil into the paper. And then along the way, you're trying to smooth that out from light gray to medium gray to dark gray. And so that is kind of my conceptualization of rehab, is how smooth can you get that start to finish, to make it so that there's no spikes in any of your variables, to make it so that they are subjectively feeling good at the same time as the objective data would support that they are feeling good. So it's the combination of all of those variables and trying to manipulate them appropriately.
Yeah. That's great. There was 2 great things that I'm going to take with me personally from his presentation. And the first was working backwards, writing a return to play plan. Where did you get that idea?
That definitely came from the Dynamo, and that was one of the mistakes that I was making early on. Was I was trying to progress it day by day, and again, they felt really good, so we kept progressing, and they felt really good, so we kept progressing, and then we had a setback with it was actually contralateral injury, but the progression was very expedited relative to what it should have been. And so if you know the timeline, you know when they should be back into some of these like full training or game minutes. And so if you start there, then you know the roadmap along the way. If you're driving the speed limit, you should get to Katy from downtown Houston in, 40 minutes or something. But if you get to Katy in 15 minutes, you know that you were going way faster than you probably should have been. So, yeah.
Yeah, taking the time whenever you know how long it should be to get back, right?
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that I'm going to take with me and possibly to the football setting is curvilinear running, because obviously in soccer that's huge. But where did that come about?
Yeah, there's some really good research on that, and the one that I referenced in the presentation is I can't remember the authors off the top of my head, but I can, if anybody wants to reach out to me, I can definitely send it. And what they did was they took the edge of the box, so the half circle around like the penalty spot, and they had their athletes run along that curve so that the curve was uniform. It wasn't created, like a lot of times we'll create curves with cones, but it's not uniform. Sometimes one cone's sticking out a little bit further than it should be, and so it's not necessarily a smooth curve. So keeping a uniform curve is really important, and then having it symmetrical where they're curving to the left, curving to the right. And what we see is that there's actually a little bit of a skill element to it. So your fastest linear sprinters aren't necessarily your fastest curvilinear sprinters, and that's a really important variable to kind of tease out. Is if somebody struggles technically on the curve, that's going to open them up to a risk injury if they're running curves in a game.
Interesting. Any other questions, Joey? Okay, if people wanted to reach out to you, how would they do that, Matthew?
Probably the easiest way is on Instagram, at Spotlight Sports Solutions. I'm most responsive there. Even my parents will try to text or call me, and I won't respond for 3 to 5 business weeks. Yeah, probably Instagram is probably the fastest way to get a hold of me.
All right. Awesome. And the link for this is smb.com/bridging the rehab gap. Thank you.